Hey everybody, this is Ibarionex from the Candid Frame, and I'm going to do something different. It's something that I've been meaning to do for a while, and I'm finally getting around to it, which is share more of my own work on this channel. I use a lot of the images that you submit regularly to the Flickr pool, and I discuss a lot of principles about how to create better photographs. And as I've mentioned probably numerous times, I try to apply the same things to my own work. And I recently shot a Black History parade that begins not too far from where I live. I try to do it each year. It's so conveniently close that unless I have a conflict of some sort, I try to photograph it. It begins in a park, so all the people that are in the parade gather at the park before they move down into Pasadena. And the beginning of a parade, before the marching actually starts, is usually the most interesting time to make photographs because everyone is so busy getting ready, getting prepared, that the presence of a camera is really not very intrusive. They expect cameras to be there. And so it allowed me a degree of freedom to get in fairly close and to work a scene where I'm photographing, perfect strangers, um, to an extent that normally isn't available to me while I'm working just a normal sidewalk in the city. And one of the things that I was trying to go for, because I've photographed this event so many times, is I didn't want to create the same images, all over again. I mean, there's little point to go out there if all I'm doing is repeating myself. So one of the things that I wanted to do is I wanted to create images with depth. So I was not just trying to get an interesting character or a good gesture or good light. I was trying to build more complex compositions that had more than just a subject and an interesting or pleasing background. And it's a lot harder than you might think to be able to do that, especially with scenes that are so fluid and ever changing. So I'm going to show you some of the pictures here. Not all of them were successful, but I still want to give you sort of a sense of what I was trying for. The great majority of the pictures, were just me just documenting the day. But whenever I recognized the moment for the potential to give me something a little more complex, I really try to go for that. So let's just jump into a few images here. Okay, when I first arrived there, these cadets were getting ready. They were putting on their helmets, adjusting all the different parts of their uniform, getting their rifles, flags, getting into position. And they were all clustered. They weren't organized in a line or an organized file at that point. And one of the things that I wanted to do is I wanted to leverage this early morning light that I saw illuminating some of those people's faces, but I wanted to get an interesting gesture, especially since many of them were adjusting their uniforms or about to put on their helmets. But I wanted to include a foreground element in the shot, and this is one of the first ones that I attempted to make. I spent about 10 or 15 minutes with this group, but never really succeeded. But I thought of the shots that I made, this was probably the more effective. I like the gesture of her sort of, touching her eye, but because of how everyone was shifting around, some of the other frames either obscured her or I had an issue with where the exposure on my camera changed, so they were all blown out. But you can see here that I'm not only aware of the girl, but I'm aware of the figures in the foreground, and especially the reflection of these helmets that were really highly shined up. So this is what I was going for whenever possible. Now, later on, when I went into the park, I saw these girls who were practicing lifting one of them up into the air, and she would sort of flip down to the ground. And I almost immediately went in fairly tight. And I forgot to say that I'm using the Fujifilm X100F, which is, my standard camera, which has the equivalent of a 35 millimeter focal length. It's a 23 millimeter, but because it's on an APS-C sensor, there's a magnification ratio about 1.5 times. So I went in and I really liked what was happening with the girls, but I really didn't have a whole lot of time in terms of trying to figure out the frame. So I just quickly moved in and I made a series of shots. And this shot is kind of interesting because even though we don't see the top of the girl and her face, there's something that's very pleasing in terms of the way these arms are leading up into the frame, into this girl's legs who disappear. And I like these sort of diagonal lines here that help to lead us into the frame. But I'm not completely pleased with this image because I was really trying to create images with more depth. And even though, the lines and the colors and the gestures here are really interesting, the background really isn't anything special for me. It's just a backdrop, and I especially don't like these figures back here. There are some shadows here that might have been interesting, but part of the issue was, I think, at least in terms of this frame, is that I wasn't wide enough. I needed really like a 28 or a 24 to make this work a little more effectively, but because I don't have an adapter that gives me a wider focal length and I didn't have another camera with me, I just have to sort of make do with that 35 millimeter focal length. But I still like the moment, but considering what I was going for, I didn't think that this image satisfied me. Now, I had moved back to shoot something that was happening elsewhere. And as I turned around and started moving back, I saw that they had returned to throwing this girl up into the air. And that's when I recognized that I could get the image that I was hoping to get. So I get them um, uh, catching her just as she's dropping into the air, which is a wonderful gesture. I really love the line that her body creates in the middle of the frame. These girls are reaching out to catch her. It's really nice. She's really well defined, even though there are a lot of trees and there's a telephone pole behind her. But what makes the shot work for me even better than the previous one is the fact that I have these other young girls in the foreground. And this group here and this group here help to frame this area right here. And the presence of this shadow also helps to sort of lead the eye to the center of attention. So even though we have this cluster of trees in the back, she still is something that is readily and easily read within the context of the frame. And those lines that I mentioned earlier are still present. I don't necessarily like this branch here, but I'm not the kind of guy who's going to go into Photoshop and take stuff like that out. I mean, there's a little piece of trash here on the ground, and I know you could sort of clone those things out, but I don't tend to do that. And I think had I if I hadn't been reacting so quickly to getting the shot, I might have noticed those things at the edges of the frame and then just moved in slightly to eliminate them. If not eliminate them, reduce their presence within the frame. But I literally had just turned around when that scene presented itself. So I only had a split second in order to make the shot. And I'm really pleased with this because this was more about where I was trying to what I was trying to achieve with these more layered, complex compositions. Now, soon after that, I was walking around a little further, and there were a lot of these band members that were around practicing, and there are so many people, these kids preparing with their trumpets, their drums. I could make shots of them just playing their instruments, but that alone wasn't going to be interesting. I've made those images so many times before that I just felt, you know, I would have just been duplicating myself. But I'm walking and I spot the light that's hitting his gloved hand. And I see the fall off of light that's happening on his face because you can see it if you look at the upper right hand corner. There's shadow at the top of the bridge of his nose and falling away from his cheek. And that concentration of light really excited me. So I immediately knew that I could use that contrast of light and shadow to help isolate attention to that area of the frame, his hand, the trumpet, his lips on the mouthpiece. So I moved in, and he was, taking no, he was not taking any mind of me at all as he was playing. So he was moving up and down, and I was paying careful attention to not only the position of the trumpet, but also his fingers and his hands. And at some point, he sort of tilted down, creating this really nice implied diagonal line within the frame, which adds a lot of energy. And you can see here, you get this nice flow of the arm that leads to here. But I was also paying attention to these other band members in the back. And thankfully, you can identify who they are. They're not completely relegated to shadow, but that presence of that shadow really helps to create this contrast between light and dark, between him and all the other elements here, all the other figures in the frame. This guy I was definitely paying attention to because he was changing his position as much as the guy in the foreground was. So his position and the way he sort of his line of sight and his trumpet intersects here really works beautifully for this frame. I also like the presence of the tree here that keeps this area from being dominated by just blue. So again, this was one of the shots that achieved what I was going for. So I was constantly observing scenes, trying to find different elements that I could play off of each other, and it was hard to be quite honest. When I would recognize something, I would be really quick to try to move into place, and sometimes things just changed so quickly that I just didn't have enough time to really sort of figure out exactly how I could pull it together. But I'm glad that I gave myself the exercise to be able to do that. Now, this is probably the most successful image, or probably the second one of the day. I saw these girls practicing. I probably have photographed these girls every time I have gone to the parade, and I kind of knew what to expect from them. And as I approached, I realized that I might be able to use the presence of the coach in the foreground to create that depth. So, because I could have gotten it in front of the coach and photographed the girls at the front of the line and then use the receding positions of the other girls to create some depth and use the shallow depth of field and all that other stuff to isolate someone. But again, I wanted something interesting. And then I also noted the shadows that were on the ground. And I wanted to use all those things. I wanted to create that depth. So I got down on the ground and I positioned myself right behind Coach T here. And just as I came down, this girl on the left, between the figure on the far left and the middle, all of a sudden just spontaneously jumped into the air and did this with her body and her mouth and her tongue. And it was just an amazing little moment. I really love that she's sort of framed and cleanly defined here in this space. And you can see all these other girls are sort of like waiting for their coach to give them direction. But for whatever reason, this girl just jumped up. And she wasn't doing it for the benefit of the camera. She was just, she was just full of energy. And we just found a way to release it. So I really like that moment. The right side of the frame, I'm not particularly thrilled with, just because this is just so static. But man, this moment really is so special and so unusual, and it's so expressive that I think it kind of makes up for that. And I could crop this image severely and just like get rid of all this and crop it as a square. That's an option, but like I said, and this was cropped to using the 16:9 format, because I found that the 16:9 format just worked better for this particular shot. Most of the other shots are completely full frame, but this is the one shot in which I, decided to use a different, ratio in order to render the image. Now, this is another image that isn't successful for me. This was actually during the parade. And I noticed that the woman who was in the lead of these girls was extending her arm out and sort of directing the girls behind her. And so I knew I wanted to use her hand in the frame. And in a couple of shots, I was in really tight. So all you saw was her hand coming into the frame. But the moment that was happening with the girls it wasn't gelling. And this doesn't work for me either. I love her gesture in this, but it's the staticness of the girls behind her uh, that make the shot just fall apart. I mean, this line and gesture is great, but there's nothing here. There's nothing here. This girl is giving me something interesting, but she's really sort of the only one. And sometimes you may have the basically the elements, but especially when it's multiple people in the frame, they don't always sort of synchronize in a way that produce a great shot. I still like the fact that I went for it and tried it, but most of the shots that I attempted to do this with, failed. So these are the three images that I was most pleased with, and if I have a favorite, it's probably this one, even though it's not perfect, and this is kind of my second favorite. This is nice, but I think these two are much more interesting, and all of these happened before the parade, and I photographed the entire length of the parade, but the great majority of the images that I made walking the parade route were just sort of lackluster. I just didn't have the opportunity for these layered compositions that I had at the very beginning of the parade, which is one of the reasons I really recommend that you always attend the beginning of a parade or any sort of event, because that's where the richness, that's where the opportunities are, and especially if you want to photograph people and get in close, you'll be amazed at what you're able to do under such circumstances. All right, I hope you found that helpful. I'm going to be doing this a lot more often, but let me know what you think. And my new book, Making Photographs, Developing a Personal Visual Workflow, is available now. You can order it through the Rocky Nook website and get it for 40% off when you use the promo code Pirello40. You can always also order it via Amazon, and I think it's discounted pretty well there, so the prices are going to be fairly comparable. So if you prefer to order it through Amazon because you're a Prime member, you can go ahead and do that. And if you like the book, and let me know. You can either send me a message here or just write a review, and that's especially appreciated because it goes a long way to helping spread the word. And also, I normally pull images from the Candid Frame Flickr pool, which I'm going to continue to do. And if you want to submit images to the pool and contribute to the community, just go to Flickr and do a search on the Candid Frame, where you'll find this page, and just ask to be added. Now, you'll have to do it on your computer. If you try it on your tablet or your phone, you'll get a message that it's a private group and you have to be invited. That's just a problem if you're trying to add yourself using your phone or tablet. If you go through your computer, it won't be a problem. I usually approve people once a week. And lastly, The Candid Frame is my podcast in which I feature conversations about all aspects of photography. I interview not only street photographers, but portrait photographers, landscape photographers, documentary photographers. Most recent conversation with Michael A. McCoy. He is a photojournalist out of the D.C. area and an Iraq vet who uses photography in a variety of ways, not only to earn a living, but also it also helped him to cope with his PTSD after his service. And he's used that to help other veterans as well. So if you've never listened to the episode of The Candid Frame, this is a good place to start. And if you like what you're seeing in these videos, give us a thumbs up. And see you next time.